for anyone who wants to watch this later. Okay, I think I'm now recording. So at the bottom of this screen, if you're joining by computer, there is a little raise your hand function that you can do if you want to talk. So you can do that and I can call on people, so that can kind of help facilitate and prevent people from talking over each other. And yes, that's where you can also mute yourself. And if you click on something that looks like a little chat bubble and you hover over it, it's the conversation. So you can show the conversation and hide the conversation. So you can also ask questions in the chat in that way. And so multiple opportunities for people to be involved. Did I miss anything?
I don't think so.
Okay.
One way maybe to get started is to see if anybody had questions from the previous chat discussion or regarding Jasmine's presentation that they didn't get to ask.
Yeah, so feel free to add it into the chat or to talk. You can raise your hand as well if you'd like.
I have a question, but I'm calling in by phone.
Okay.
What is the approximate timeline for the application process for these between application and approval?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for the licensing piece, well, for all of these, it kind of depends on whether or not the applications themselves are complete. But once there's a completed application, if it's a primary accessory short-term rental, so it's someone's primary home that they are renting out, and it's just a licensing process, that'll go a lot faster. I'm not entirely sure what the average amount of time it is to get a license. We have some other licensing programs in the county, marijuana license and liquor license and things like that. But I'm not entirely sure. I want to say maybe a month maximum. Hannah, do you have any thoughts?
So the length of time for a land use review is certainly going to depend on the type of use you're proposing. You know, the limited impact special review, that's a process that includes a Board of County Commissioners hearing, for instance. The special use process includes both a planning commission and a Board of County Commissioners hearing. And then the limited impact waiver is something that's done at a staff level. So sort of the more complicated a review gets, the longer it takes. Yeah. So a straightforward limited impact can take maybe 4 to 8 weeks. A limited impact, a waiver could take 4 to 8 weeks. The process, which requires a Board of County Commissioners hearing, I think takes 8 to 12 weeks. And then from there, the special uses usually are 4 months, 4 to 6 months, depending on the complexity of the application.
Yeah, so quite a range. Do you have any follow-up questions based on that, or perhaps something that's we can look into a little bit further and try to get back to you?
Well, it's a related question. So you're in the process of revising this code, and what do I do at this point? Do I apply under the old process, or I wait until the new process is complete?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'll take a first stab and then feel free to jump in. It kind of, that question really is up to you. So we've gone over what the proposed regulations are, and our goal is to implement that in early 2021. And if you are able to come in and get on the docket and all of that before the code changes, you'd be subject to whatever our current code is. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a personal choice whether or not you come in under our existing code or wait for the new regulations to be proposed. Either way, you'll have to get a license. So, yeah, it kind of depends. I also do know that our Board of County Commissioners have a very they're only taking public hearings on one day of the week, and so they're kind of booked out quite a ways to the end of this year. So it wouldn't be guaranteed that you would be able to schedule a public hearing quickly at all.
So there's not a lot of options for somebody who is limited income, you know, due to COVID and wants to do this because it's getting held up in the process. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, unfortunately, you have to come in for a process in order to be able to do this. If it is your primary residence and you're renting it out for some supplemental income, then I might suggest waiting for the new regulations, because you would just have to come in for a license, and that will be a quicker process than what we currently have in place, which often requires a public hearing. So I will say right now, you're allowed to rent a property on a short-term basis by right if it's under 14 days. So if you're only going to rent it, if you want to have some supplemental income and we'll limit it to, 14 days of rental, then that's currently a by right use and no review process is required. Okay, so John and Amy wrote in the chat is there a follow-up question to that?
Yes, please.
I have a question about the 14-day limit.
Okay, I'll get to that in 1 second. Let me finish the follow-up question first, and then we can turn to that.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I guess my point is that if I'm trying to follow the regulations and I can't get a hearing in time, and this land use code won't be finished until the spring, but I really need the income and I want to follow the guidelines, but I don't want to get large fines. It's a pretty difficult time for income right now. And do you have any leniency on that since it's 6 months away from approval?
We don't. And I want to acknowledge that it is a tough time, and I hear you. And I'm sorry that this can be a very frustrating process for people. But it is a process we have, and so yeah, the best I can say is that 14-day might be something to kind of help a little bit, though it's definitely not enough, I don't think, based on what you're saying, but it's what we have, and so I'm sorry that we just don't have anything different. But I encourage you to come to the Planning Commission hearing or the Board of County Commissioner hearing and maybe state your case there and talk to them about it, and maybe that they'll be able to address it, or it's another forum at least to express your concerns.
Well, thank you for your honesty. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I think there's another question from someone over the phone asking about the 14-day period that I was talking about. So if you could ask your question, I'd be happy to.
Okay. Well, in the survey that we all took, that was one of the questions. Should it be, kept at 14 days? Should it be expanded? Should it be less? And I'm thinking, especially in line with the last participant's issue and questioning, that even if the planning department could put in a temporary expansion of that 14-day, that might be a way to soften some of the no leniency that we're hearing from you. And I mean, even if, and financially, things can be very tight for me as well, limited income. And, I think most of us want to be fair players. We want to play by the rules. And, and we see some good reasoning for changing some of the rules. But on the other hand, you're kind of putting people in between a rock and a hard spot here. And I would suggest whatever you can do to soften that bind, it would be helpful to, I'm sure, many of us here in the unincorporated county. That's all
Yeah.
I've got.
Okay. Well, thank you for your.
Question.
Oh yeah. Go for it, Hannah.
Are you renting on a short-term basis while you're in your house?
So right now, this situation doesn't affect me too much because I've got it rented on a longer term basis. But you know, I'm just talking in generality about that 14-day period and about the issue that most of us are facing right now. So anyway, I'm done with my question and comment.
All right.
Well,
I
would go to follow up on the previous two speakers, because on the one hand, Jasmine, you're saying this is a draft and you're looking for input. And on the other hand, the way what I heard you answer was basically no leniency. The new process is going to come in at such and such. You might want to consider that. So it seems to me like you have already pretty much nailed down what you're going to go to the Planning Commission with. So maybe you can address that, whether you really seriously are looking for input or whether we're just going through an exercise here.
Right. Yes, happy to address that. And I want to first acknowledge the call for maybe some sort of temporary ability to rent out while the code is being changed, or something like that. So thank you for those comments, and that's something that we can discuss as a staff to see if there's any feasibility to do that. And then turning to your question, John, I believe you were asking it about, is this just an exercise? And no, it's not just an exercise. It truly is a draft. I think part of the issue is that there's a process concern, and then there's what the code language itself states. So currently, the code doesn't allow you to rent if it's more than 14 nights. Our new code will allow you to come in just for a license, which will be a lot quicker of a process than what we currently have. But something that is being asked to allow people to rent right now, as part of, to help stem some of the negative economic impacts of COVID, and things like that, that would be asking for a temporary change in what we currently have, sort of like an emergency ordinance or something like that, which is beyond the scope of what we are doing and would require quick and different action from our Board of County Commissioners. So to the extent that it sounds as though, I'm not advocating or proposing or thinking that we can change the 14 days, it's because it's a little bit beyond the scope of this code update and would require a different process from the Board of County Commissioners. But I am hearing that concern, and it's something that I can address with some of my superiors to see if maybe that's something that the board would consider doing while we do change the code. To the extent that there are questions or concerns or proposed changes to the draft that was discussed that would be implemented in early 2021, open to input, happy to receive input, and it's not just an exercise. And so, but I will say, to the extent that some of the comments I'm hearing or that don't get changed before it goes to the Planning Commission, it's not necessarily because I'm not listening to who's in the room. It's because I'm considering who's in the room. I'm trying to consider who's not in the room, people who have systemically not been able to participate in public hearing processes, and trying to balance to the best of my ability the positive and negative impacts that short-term rentals have. So if a change is proposed here and it doesn't make its way into the Planning Commission, it's not because I'm not hearing you, but it's because we've decided after discussing those comments that that change is not in the direction that we want to go. but you can still propose that change in the Planning Commission hearing, the Board of County Commissioner hearings, because the Board of County Commissioners is the ultimate decision-making body. So we have that.
So let me build on your answer there a little bit and go with the question that we have up. I suspect that one group that you're not hearing a lot from are the, folks, and I'm going to say the folks with not historic cabins, but older cabins all along Peak Highway that are probably not as computer literate as us on this Zoom call, that would be asking the question similar to what was in your frequently asked questions about why, should I be responsible for bringing an older building up to code? I'm an engineer. I understand about building codes, and I understand that a county bureaucrat looking at a new construction versus an old construction, the building inspector could very well remove most of that short-term rentals building stock along the Peak Highway from active use, because a lot of it was built in 1920s, 30s, 40s, and the codes at that time were probably A, not enforced, and B, were nowhere near as strict or stringent as they are now. And your proposed license process and your proposed descriptions in the land use code make no allowance for that. So I'd like to specifically suggest that there be an allowance made, and that a process be spelled out so that it's not just what you said, that a building inspector is going to come in and only look at the carbon monoxide detector and the fire alarms and some basic safety stuff, because unless it's spelled out, they will look at everything with the view of, treating all properties equal, new construction, blah, 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 and you will eliminate most of that older building stock. You will eliminate the possibility of the first lady to have any retirement income. And I am basing that on experience working with a civil engineering company with Boulder County that I mentioned to you the last time we spoke, where a subdivision wanted to replace an old aging water tank that supplied both their potable drinking water and their fire protection water. And that got tied up in county review for more than a year. And the reason it got tied up was because it sat on the property of the head of the water district. And he was perfectly willing to do it. And the county had a regulation that you couldn't have two uses on the same piece of property. And
Right.
You basically compromised public safety, because if the tank had failed and there was a fire, there was no way of getting water to that subdivision.
Yeah.
But because of the intransigence of the county, you compromise public safety. So unless it's spelled out, and given that past experience, I have no faith in the county to do what you previously said, that they would only come and look at minor things in an older property, and they'd look at more on vacation property. It needs to be spelled out. So that's my input, and I'd like to address that.
Yeah. Well, John.
And the final draft.
Yes. John, I want to thank you for raising that concern. It is something that we have heard from other people as well. And so I'll start by saying a couple of things. So first of all, the building code, we can't change the building code through this process because we're changing the land use code and our authority is restricted to that. And they are two separate documents. but I am hearing the concern about people who do rent out or want to rent out some of these unique older cabins, and, you know, potentially being not able to do that, or it's cost prohibitive if they have to bring it up to code. So in our licensing ordinance, we did our best to address that and spell it out in the language itself. And in the licensing ordinance, we state for short-term rentals, so those primary accessory rentals, so it's primary home, and then second homes that'll be rented 60 days or fewer. We state, quote, the dwelling unit has no observable structural defects and any plumbing, electrical, and heating and cooling systems are in a good state of repair. And nothing on the premises poses a significant risk to health, safety, or welfare of the occupants or surrounding properties. So for those, we don't state anything about how it has to be brought up to the current code or anything like that. It just is, we're focused on safety, and it's spelled out there so that the building inspectors will look at that and know that that is their purview. For the vacation rentals, so that is the homes that are being rented out for many more nights per year. There is a concern about occupant safety there, and trying to balance, you know, not bringing it all the way up to code, perhaps, you know, but also knowing that people are renting these who are unfamiliar with the property or and things like that, so they need to be safe. For those, we require the dwelling unit to be legally existing or have been constructed under a valid building permit. And for that permit, we state that it must meet the applicable building code as required when the dwelling unit was constructed or when upgrades to the structure subject to a building permit were made. So that doesn't require everyone to come into the current building code. It says, you know, it has to come up to the building code required when the unit was constructed or when upgrades to that structure subject to a building permit were made. So doing our best to address some of that. And if you don't think that that is clear enough, definitely invite some suggestions on how to edit that language to make it a bit more clear to the building inspectors and everyone involved.
And I'll be happy to look at that and give you some input, because
Great.
I hear what you say, and I read through all of that, and I still have the concern. So I think structural can be in the eyes of the building inspector. And like I said, with that previous experience with Boulder County, frankly, I don't trust your inspectors to go light. I trust them to go heavy.
Well, yeah, then I do encourage you, please send me some language that you think would be appropriate, keeping in mind our goals to balance, you know, a little bit of safety here and understanding the negative impacts that could have on these property owners. So, yeah, please send me some language you think might be more appropriate.
I have no concern about some safety requirements. So,
okay, great.
I'll go ahead and let others talk.
All right. Thank you, John. I see John Lineweber has his hand raised, and it's been raised for a little bit. So turning to you, John.
Hi. So it's actually, here's
John and Debbie.
Yeah.
Hi, John and Debbie.
So I just have a clarifying question about the process. So we have a family-based cabin. So I think it falls under the secondary in our little flow chart, the second one over from the left. And we usually rent it for around 40 to 45 nights. And we filled out all the forms that we've needed to do that and everything like that. So my clarifying question is this. So we don't rent it over the winter. So I usually, the first part of the year, like January, February is when I fill out the form. We've had the building inspector come out and everything like that in anticipation for spring, summer, and fall. Because we spread out our rentals from May to the end of September, because we use the cabin a lot also during that time.
Mhm.
So my question is, if I heard you right, if I submit the form that I normally have filled out before the planning commission makes the new regulations, then I would just need to come in for a license. I could bypass in some ways the hearing or from what I understood, it was more at the staff level that we would be at.
Right.
Then would that be the case then? And then at the 2-year renewal, we would go through that process again. So I just need some clarification there, because like the other lady, I just want to do the right thing. And so I just want to make sure that, I've got the right plan.
Right. Well, thank you, Debbie, for bringing that up. So yes, if you are renting, and you have been renting under the current code as allowed, so for some people you just have to register and then comply with, making sure you follow the requirements in the code. If you're doing all of that and you are continuing to do that, then you're operating a permissible short-term rental in the county currently. And because of that, you would be able to just come in and get a license and continue to operate with the license. And so the license will help other people know, yes, you're approved by the county. And at the 2-year renewal, you would also, as long as you've just been operating according to whatever you were allowed to do earlier, you'd be considered what's called a non-conforming use, and you're able to continue operating as a non-conforming use at the same level that you had been in the past. So no more or less. You can't just start renting way more in the future or something like that. You have to stick to what you've been doing. Then at the renewal, you would just also have to renew your license and not come into any sort of process. Yeah,
Sorry.
you can clarify.
Currently, people, I think they submit an annual registration.
Yeah.
That goes away, correct,
Yes.
and is replaced by the licensing.
Yes, correct. So we don't have new regulations yet, so you'd still have to submit your registration. And if it's in line with you still needing to submit that, keep doing that. In the future, you would just come in for a license and then renew that license. To the extent you would want to expand the number of nights, so maybe do 50 nights a year or something like that, or change how you are currently using the short-term rental, then you would have to come in through a process to kind of expand your use. And if you did fall under the secondary accessory short-term rental, which it sounds like that's kind of how you're operating, then it would be staff reviews it, and it would either be a public hearing or that public hearing might be waived, depending on the impact. And so, yes, hopefully that answered it a little bit.
Yeah. So,
okay.
So my question is, I think that form we fill out usually lasts a year.
Yes.
Yes,
it does.
So then, but like currently, like if the year's obviously not up because it would be like in January. But like, so when do you anticipate like our ability to be getting a license?
And that's a little bit hard to predict because a lot of it depends. When we take this to the Planning Commission, they could recommend approval to the Board of County Commissioners and it goes fast, or they can table it and ask for changes of staff. So a lot of it's not quite in our control, but we are, our goal is to have this implemented in early 2021. But if it comes to January, when your annual registration is, due and this code's not in place yet, send another annual registration to be good for another year. And then you'll be fine. And then when the license comes into play, then you can kind of navigate that process then.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. All right, so Brian and Rosemary, I see that you have your hand up. And And then Debbie, if you don't have any other questions, maybe put your hand down just so I don't get confused. But if you have another one that comes up, raise your hand again.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, Brian and Rosemary.
So we're on live. You hear?
It's a little bit hard to hear you, but you can start going for it, and I'll see if we can piece it together. And if not, maybe I'll ask you to call in on your phone.
Or type in the chat.
Yes.
Well, we're the ones that asked about the properties. We invested 3 years pocket expand in a one bedroom.
Brian, I think I'm going to stop you because it's hard for me to hear you, and I want to be able to hear you. Do you think maybe you'd be able to call in? That might make it clearer for me to hear you. And
the number.
yeah, let me get you the phone number. 1 minute. Okay, so the phone number is 720-400-7859, and I'm going to type it in the chat again. 720-400-7859. And then the conference ID is 229-365-87. So 229-365-87.
You should probably mute your computer app.
So there's no feedback, because sometimes that happens if you call in and have it on your computer. All right, I see that you've joined by phone, so let's try it now.
We are the ones that called in about a cabin that we have spent 3 years of considerable money out of pocket that is part of the historical landmark registration of Boulder County as well. And it's a 1-bedroom, and we have it on the market for rental. It has been CO'd by recent inspections. We had a grand opening July 4th and 5th. And we have been doing what we call VRBO type rental with our house for about 9 or 10 years. We were engaged in this in the early 90s as well, so we've been in the industry about almost 30 years. And what we're running up against is now we can only get one license if that's what we, the direction we choose to go with everything. Which means we can only rent the cabin or the house, but we cannot do both. And this has been a 30-year struggle of sweat, blood, and tears to create a type of retirement. And what I see is 30 years now is just going out the window in a cloud of smoke, with no possible recourse of what I think the word that's being used is leniency, of grandfather clausing, of where is the meeting in the middle, so to speak, for people like us? I guess that would be the question. There's a secondary question, and that is, what keeps the public review process from becoming I've talked to several people that have described situations where this complaint, this right of complaint by anybody, and I guess it's usually anonymous, so you can't face your accusers, where the community, the people that are disgruntled with this industry for one reason or another, are going to be able to use this public review process to become a vendetta on people that have been truly trying to provide a quality type of rental for tourism from all over the world. So I guess those are I guess that would be two questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks for calling in. Made it much easier to hear you. So if I understand it correctly, your two questions, the first one is essentially addressing the one license limit we have, especially because there's people like yourselves or perhaps others as well who rent out both their primary residence and have some other investment property. And the second question is about the public review process. So perhaps in terms of both if there's complaints received about a property, how those are enforced, and then if there's public hearing requirements that have to happen, how do we make sure that both of those processes don't get hijacked, so to speak, by one or two people who have an agenda against short-term rentals and are using that forum to address their concerns. So I will turn to the first question of the one license restriction. So there's a couple things. Like I talked about the grandfathering process earlier, really, unfortunately, I do think that there are a lot of rentals in the county who have been renting for a long time and didn't realize that they had to come in for some sort of review process to do so. And I sympathize with that issue because, you know, we're here now where we are, and it's perhaps an impermissible rental in the eyes of Boulder County, and that's frustrating and hard. But those kinds of rentals we cannot grandfather in because they're not allowed under our current code. And so there's that. And I hear your concern about just having one license because some people might want a couple. And I'll note that. I do think the reason we landed on one license was to try to preserve housing stock to the best we can. So there might be some people like yourselves who do rent out their primary home and then have a cabin that wouldn't even be used for long-term rental anyway that might get caught up in this. And I think this is just the balance that we're trying to strike with, you know, there being other people who want multiple licenses because they buy multiple investment properties in Boulder County and take them out of stock for long-term rental. Some solutions might be to try to have long-term rentals, though I do think that might not be for everyone and that might not be the direction you want to go, but that is an option, is to turn one of the properties into a more long-term rental. And that means just rented over 30 days at a time. So someone rents it for 1 month at a time. So just, it could be 1 month, it could be 2 months, it could be 3 months. But I recognize that is not going to be a satisfactory answer. And I can only say I'm sorry about that. And I hope that you bring your concerns to the public hearing process when we go in front of the Planning Commission and the Board of County Commissioners. So, Hannah, do you have anything to add to that, or I'll turn to the second question?
In regards to the number of licenses?
Yes.
No, I really do think it's just a matter of trying to balance a lot of different agendas and interests.
Yeah. So
the other thing that might actually be helpful to say here is that at this, the way the regulations are written, there are a lot of numerical elements to it. The number of licenses, sort of the number of days. I don't know that anything we land on is going to be perfect for everybody. There really isn't sort of a right answer. There's not a perfect answer. It really is challenging to write regulations for a community like Boulder County that is so diverse, that has a lot of diverse interests, a lot of different challenges. And so what we try to do is to balance those things.
Yeah, I'll just echo that and acknowledge that as of the way that the draft is written right now, it will not be necessarily what you want, Brian and Rosemary, and I'll just acknowledge that that's frustrating. So in terms of the second question, how do we make sure that the public hearing process, to the extent that that's required at the front end to be able to use the property as a short-term rental, and at the back end, if a complaint is raised about an existing short-term rental and that's being looked at to see how it should be enforced, how is that not hijacked by one or two people who are just very disgruntled with the short-term rental industry? That's definitely a concern that we have as well. So there's a couple things. I'll start by addressing the public hearing process. So one thing that we are trying to do through this update is differentiate the different types of uses of short-term rentals. So for the primary residence, primary accessory short-term rental, we're taking those rentals out of the public hearing process, and it's just going to require a license. So those are the rentals that, as a staff, we've decided that those have a smaller impact on Boulder County. You know, they'll facilitate some of the positive things of helping the local economy, helping people who live in those homes be able to afford the homes and things like that. And so we are taking some of those away from the public hearing process. For the other options, the vacation rental and the secondary accessory short-term rental, well, for the secondary accessory, we've instituted a waiver process. So if the director, of community planning and permitting, which would be Dale, determines that that use is not going to be in conflict with the criteria in the code, then it'll be an administrative review and there will be no public hearing process. So that's another way that we've tried to carve out a couple of these to be away from a public hearing process and more in the hands of staff who would review it against the criteria in the code as a more analytical way to go about it. Although we all have faults, right? Yes, please.
Thank you. With the waiver, or as Jasmine's explaining this, one thing I want to make sure folks understand is part of the drafting of these regulations and what we're trying to incorporate in the draft are those protections for the community already. They're incorporated in the licensing scheme to try to mitigate negative impacts on neighbors in the community. So while we may be moving something to a waiver to sort of minimize the bureaucracy basically around getting one of these approved, it does not mean that we are not paying attention to the potential impacts of those things on neighbors.
Right. Yes. Good clarification. It's something that we still consider. Yeah. And then for the other ones that do have to have a public hearing, it's a vacation rental or the secondary accessory where the director determined there is some conflict with the criteria in the code. There will be, people who are disgruntled with the industry who show up and express those concerns, and they have a right to do that. And hopefully there will also be people who, are your neighbors or that you invite to the hearing that will help vouch that you operate the process in a way that isn't detrimental to the community and does help the community, so it can kind of balance that input. But the Board of County Commissioners and the Planning Commission are also aware that the voices they hear in the room are not necessarily representative of the broader community, and will do their best to keep that in mind. I think it's helpful to remind the commissioners of that, and that's something that as staff we can keep in mind and maybe start hearings that way. Or people who do show up, or yourselves, if you are the applicants, can also remind the board, hey, please keep in mind when you hear from people in this room, is it representative of the broader community? And I do think that that is something that internally as staff we are continually working on, and right now in particular addressing, because there are certain groups of people who just are not able to participate in public hearings for whatever reason. And so that's something to keep in mind, and we are doing our best with that. In terms
Can I
of the,
elaborate here too?
yes, feel free.
Okay. A couple of other ways I think the process works that helps to try and address that issue is that the Board of County Commissioners has a set standard criteria that they're using to evaluate all of these processes, all of these applications. And what they do is sort of over time develop kind of a consistent methodology for examining them. So they get sort of an equal level of scrutiny. How neighbors often play into the review process is alerting the planner and the decision makers to potential negative impacts of something on a site-specific basis. So, if a neighbor, an immediately adjacent neighbor is much more familiar with the way a property operates than a planner ever is going to be. We go do a site visit, we try to do our best with an analysis, but people who live in the area are going to know more about how the rental has been functioning, even things like where people park and how the trash is dealt with. So it helps us, it informs the process and helps identify potential problems and potentially, positive aspects. So for instance, if there's a parking issue that the community alerts us to, we might end up with conditions of approval in the docket about parking. So this is not a vote of the people screaming the loudest.
Yeah. Thank you, Hannah, for those additional clarifications. And in terms of the other side where the public could provide a lot of input, it's in terms of making complaints and saying, hey, a property is not operating like their license allows, or things like that. And right now we do operate under a complaint-based system for any violation of the land use code. And it's something that we're evaluating for this update, whether or not it'll stay complaint-based only, or we'll do more active enforcement for short-term rentals. But we do have to verify every complaint that comes through. So it's not just someone complains and then we issue a notice of violation. It's someone complains and then our staff will have to evaluate whether or not that complaint, there's any merit to it. Is there an actual violation on the property? And if not, nothing happens. If there is a violation of the property, then that has to be addressed, but it's not, immediately shut down. There's a conversation with staff on, okay, hey, you can't have that shed that you built unless you get a permit. So you have to come in and get a permit and things like that. So I do want to thank you for raising that concern, because it's important for us to keep hearing that concern and being reminded that the loudest voices aren't the only voices. So thank you for raising that, and it's something we'll do our best to keep in mind. John Lineweber also had the same concern, so hopefully this addressed it a little bit. And then he also suggested potentially for situations like yourselves, Brian and Rosemary, that there could be special provisions for people over a certain age or people that have lived or owned properties for many, many years to be able to keep renting those, or having 2 licenses maybe for a short period of time. And that is a creative and perhaps different solution to this. So I wrote it down, and it's something that we can talk about and as staff and potentially incorporate. And if not, then I encourage other people to raise that later on. But thanks for that suggestion, and it's something to consider. So I do recognize that we had this from 6 to 8 p.m. So I want to be respectful of people's times. If you have any other questions, I might be able to take perhaps one more.
This
So
is
feel
a
free.
very short question
Okay, great.
in regards to Brian and Rosemary.
Mm-hmm.
Since licenses can only be granted to one person, can Rosemary take out the license for one property and Brian take out the license for the other property, and they're both within compliance then? Is that a creative solution that can work?
That is a creative solution. Unfortunately, I've kind of distilled our definition, but only one person and any of their associated, entities or spouses. It's like one license per that group. So the answer to that is no. But
Is that legal? Can you do that legally?
We are running this by our county attorney's office, and as of right now, there's not been any concerns raised by that. So, but I like the creative thinking, and we hear you, and we'll go back and talk about this, because it's something that you have brought up, and so we'll see if what we've written makes sense. Okay, John and Amy, I'll take your question.
Just possibly another creative thought, and I don't know if it is or not, but this winter the county was talking with Allen's Park community about some mechanism that would allow the community to have more say over their own, like, aesthetic standards in the community to maintain the historic character. But it sounded like it was something less than incorporating as a town site that would remove or a city remove the Allen's Park from this land use code that you're talking about, but still give the community some say. So I'm wondering how that interacts with what you're proposing here. Is it possible that the community can go that route and decide as a community that they want to do things different than your short-term rental specifies?
Right. I think what you're talking about, John, is our rural community districts that can be set up. And Hannah, do you have some knowledge on that? Okay, thank you.
The Allen's Park Town Site Planning Initiative has been in process for quite some time, and so I'm not familiar with the most recent discussions on it. But some of the intent of that was to tailor some of the regulations to the town site, reflecting their unique character. However, if those districts are adopted, it's likely that the Board of County Commissioners would still need to find them sort of overall in conformance with the comprehensive plan. So the answer, I think, is yes, but to a degree. It's unlikely that the county commissioners would adopt specific zoning regulations in direct conflict to the adopted comprehensive plan. That leaves a lot of gray area to be explored.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, I think with that, I will wrap up this meeting. If there are additional questions, please feel free to call me or shoot me an email. I'll leave my email in the chat. But for those of you who are on the phone, my email is jrod E-N-B-U-R-G. So it's for my first name, Jasmine. My last name is Rodenberg. So my first initial, J, RODENBURG at bouldercounty.org. So happy to keep hearing ideas and looking forward to some of those suggestions for the building inspections and how to maybe write that in a more productive way to be clear for the public and the building inspectors themselves. So thank you all for attending. I look forward to keeping this conversation going, and yeah, I hope you all have a good night.
Thanks, Jasmine. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.